Hi, my name is Mark Badwey. I, along with Kelly Smith, are the art curators for the Town of Fairhaven. The Fine Arts Department of Fairhaven is pleased to highlight 5 paintings of the town's wonderful collection. And to do that, we're going to talk about the painting itself and the artist who created it. It's my pleasure to have with us Michal Dyer from the New Bedford Whaling Museum. He's the Maritime Curator. Previously, Mr. Dyer was from the Kendall Museum in Sharon, Massachusetts. He's very well qualified to do this. Michal has written 2 books on marine artists and also numerous articles on whales, whaling, maritime history, and scrimshaw. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you from the New Bedford Whaling Museum, Mr. Michal Dyer.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you very much for the invitation to come to talk about these 5 great, I call them public treasures of American art. I call them public treasures because they are on display here in the town hall here in Fairhaven and in the Millicent Library directly across the street. They are superb examples of, obviously, of the art of the region, but they're just great American art. No matter what the scale might be of judging what great artworks are, these 5 all qualify. What's nice about this opportunity is you can take these 5 artworks together, and they all provide an exceptional insight into a great deal of regional history, but Fairhaven history in particular. So to go back a bit, the combined colonial seaports of Oxford Point and Bedford Village, Fairhaven, and eventually after the American Revolution, New Bedford, were built specifically to utilize one of the great commercial harbors on the East Coast. As a result, ship and boat building, coastal trading, privateering in wartime, whaling in the Atlantic, and by the end of the 18th century, whaling into the Pacific Ocean and into the Indian Ocean, brought wealth and fame to this region. Craftsmen flourished here on both sides of the river, blacksmiths and coopers and sailmakers and pump and block makers and painters and carpenters and a whole host of maritime trades. And before this area actually became an incubator for some of the nation's greatest fine artists, folk art like scrimshaw and journal illustration, domestic arts like portrait painting, and popular art like the 1849 Purrington and Russell Grand Panorama of a Whaling Voyage Around the World became synonymous with the profile of this maritime culture. And make no mistake, these are great American painters, all of whom have some things in common. The painters, so we got this painting is by Albert Bierstadt. This one in the lower right is R. Swain Gifford, Robert Swain Gifford. This painting in the center is William Bradford. The painting in the lower left is Lemuel Eldred, and in the upper left corner is Charles Henry Gifford, C.H. Gifford. So all of these artists emerged from an affluent maritime culture. Albert Bierstadt's father, Henry, was a cooper who was an immigrant to this country in 1832, came to New Bedford to work in the maritime trades. Charles H. Gifford's father was a boat builder, as was Lemuel Eldred's father, both in Fairhaven. William Bradford's father owned ships, including, by the way, the ship Acushnet, which Herman Melville sailed on in 1841, so that's pretty cool. By the mid-1850s, Fairhaven and New Bedford were importing roughly $3.5 million worth of whale products, sperm oil, whale oil, and whalebone annually. Earlier in the century, in the 1820s and 1830s, portrait painters took up residence in New Bedford. John James Audubon sought subscriptions to the Birds of America here. If perhaps the family origins of each of these, such as R. Swain Gifford, for instance, was not necessarily affluent, the fact that each could pursue the fine arts as a career or a natural propensity, as the case may be, suggests not only a market based upon disposable income, but an aesthetic appreciation deeply embedded at the societal level in the U.S. such possibilities were actually relatively new in America, which was just coming to respect its own history and to value its landscape, its wilderness, or should I say wildness, as a reflection of the sheer magnitude of the possibilities of American art. Landscape paintings were huge. Bierstadt and Bradford both painted canvases that were 6 feet high by 10 feet wide, and Bierstadt painted some that were even larger than that. By the mid-19th century, the fine arts were taken very seriously. The National Academy of Design had been founded in 1828 in New York, specifically to highlight the work of American artists. It had grown out of a more traditional institution, the 1802 American Academy of the Fine Arts, which encouraged European-style classical themes. But by 1859, the Cooper Union in New York was a tuition-free school to encourage the arts in any deserving candidate, no matter of race, sex, religious orientation, or any other qualification. Anybody was free to attend the Cooper Union. And thus, these artists were stepping onto a world stage, capturing the essence of the American experience, but doing it through the lens of history, landscape, seascape, and marine painting. So this affluence brought about through regional history became compounded in the late 19th century. New Bedford grew into a textile manufacturing center. Fairhaven did so as well, but Fairhaven's story diverged. With the wildly successful career of petroleum magnate Henry Huddleston Rogers, the town of Fairhaven was soon graced with magnificent architecture, a beautiful library, a beautiful high school, and dignified, beautiful town buildings like this room we're in right now. By the turn of the century, these local artists and their friends donated art to match the architecture, and today we can see these finely preserved paintings hanging in spaces, town public spaces, that you can come see, that reflect the art's significance. These are proud public buildings offering great insights into the maritime culture of the region and its place in American history. So, the paintings. Albert Bierstadt painted iconic works of American art, including this giant painting. This is held at the National Gallery of Art. It's 6 feet high by 10 feet wide, and it's called The Last of the Buffalo. And we can see his incredible fascination with the landscape of the West and with Native Americans and the flora of the wildness of the country. Bierstadt, here he is. Here's a photo and a brief biographical statement. He arrived when he was 2 years old and was a self-taught artist, and he had the wherewithal to travel to Germany to study, and he returned in 1857 an accomplished painter, and in 1858 he organized a major art exhibition in New Bedford, the New Bedford Art Association. Later he traveled through the American West in the 1860s, collecting all of the various materials that would make his reputation. He was obviously fascinated by Native Americans, the fauna of the West, and the magnificent landscapes which he captured in his dazzling paintings. The painting that we're going to talk about, his painting of Martha Simons, he donated himself to Henry Huddleston Rogers, and the painting now hangs in the Millicent Library. And he actually had this fabulous provenance letter written in 1896, where apparently what Albert Bierstadt did was he dug this painting out of his collection of paintings and gave it to the town, and it shows this woman who is said to have been the last full-blooded Wampanoag person living in the region. And she lived in the tribe's traditional summer camping grounds down on Sconnecut Neck, down the road a ways. And but I find it particularly interesting that he should have painted this portrait of this Native American woman here in New Bedford or in Fairhaven, in the days when he was developing as an artist. We can see where his interests were in fact developing. And he didn't paint a lot of portraits. He painted, mostly these large landscapes. But when he was first starting out in New Bedford, he taught. So when he taught what's called monochromatic painting, and we don't have many examples of his teaching, but we do have one at the Whaling Museum's collection. Oh, and by the way, that's the way this whole presentation is going to be set up. We're going to highlight the pieces that are in the town's collection, but we're going to put them within the context of the artist's body of work. So here's this monochromatic picture. It's a black and white picture, and it's looking down toward Fort Phoenix from the New Bedford side, and this is Palmer's Island, and we're looking again over toward Fairhaven, which, as you can see, in at least in this view, it's fairly sparsely built up at that time. But this is sort of a rare kind of primary Bierstadt view of a maritime scene. Like I said, it's in the museum collection. It's not in particularly good condition. That's what all this is. Some of the paper, there's a lot of paper loss, and the work had to be conserved. But for the 1858 art show, Bierstadt reaches back in history, and I find this particularly fascinating for an artist who painted very much in the present to have felt that the history of the region was worth paying attention to. By the 1850s, America had a history. We had a history. The United States had a history. And at that time, like I said in the introduction, these seaports were making a lot of money. These were important seaports, world seaports. The fleets from New Bedford and Fairhaven reached to the far corners of the world, and this was a famous place, and it had a really significant role in the development of the nation, both at a colonial in the colonial days and in the young republic, and so. Bierstadt reaches back into this painting Gosnold at Cuttyhunk to kind of try to interpret Bartholomew Gosnold's landing at Cuttyhunk Island in 1602, which in itself is a pretty fabulous thing, because at that time, Gosnold himself was a British explorer, one of many British explorers out there in the world. There were many voyaging explorers from France and Spain and Portugal and England, but Gosnold sailed into Buzzards Bay, and he recognized the Acushnet River out here as a particularly fine anchorage and the potential. And he was saying this in 1602. This is 20 years before the Pilgrims showed up. That this was going to make a fine commercial seaport. So he was seeing it with the eye of a mariner. But Bierstadt reaches back in history and attempts to interpret what that scene actually looked like, and it shows this sort of the settlement that the English built there to trade with the native people, and the native people were down here on the sand. He had to put these weird deer in here, which have really no place belonging in that painting, but there they are, and you can still go out to Cuttyhunk today and see this part of the island, and there's a monument out there, like the Gosnold Monument that was built in 1903. So history is building, and Bierstadt recognized it in the 1850s. So that's one great painter. The next great painter, William Bradford, and William Bradford was most famous for his scenes of the Arctic and the Eastern Arctic, so Greenland, the coast of Greenland, Davis Strait, Labrador, Newfoundland, and all of what he really seemed to enjoy painting documenting were the maritime scenes, particularly the ships that would get trapped in the ice. This giant paint, this is a giant Bradford painting, which is also 6 feet by 10 feet, and it's hanging over in the Lagoda room over in the Whaling Museum. You can go over and look at it. And he painted this painting in 1866, and again it includes all of these elements of commercial voyaging in the Arctic, seal hunting, whaling, the magnificent icebergs, the way the light shines through the ice, and all of these elements were a specialty of William Bradford's. Bradford himself, he grew up a Quaker in the family farm in Fairhaven near Parting Ways up at the head of the river. Both his mother and father came from very early family lineage, Massachusetts colonial settlers. His mother was a Kempton, and his father was, his lineage dated back to the Pilgrims. He was named for, William Bradford is named for William Bradford himself, one of the early settlers at Plymouth. His father invested in whale ships and other business interests, and William himself undertook a number of attempts at business himself. He went into, he was a clothier for a while, which some of the founding fortunes of the whaling interests in the region were people like grocers and clothiers and ship chandlers who sold their goods to the whale fishery and took their money and invested it in whaling voyages, and then it would grow from there. But Bradford, he wasn't really interested in doing that. He really wanted to pursue art. He was an artist, and he knew Bierstadt. He studied this monochromatic painting with Albert Bierstadt, but he traveled to New York to study art, and there he met a man named Albert Van Beest. Now, Van Beest actually belongs in this. If we had another painting to add to this, it would be a Van Beest, because Van Beest also came back and settled in Fairhaven and had a tremendous influence. He was a Dutch marine painter, and he had a beautiful eye for composition, and Bradford himself would absorb a lot of Van Beest's ideas about composition in the way he created his own great canvases. He earned his early living painting ship portraits. I mean, these are precise, exact ship portraits, and he painted them for the owners, of these vessels, like the Gyro Swift here. And we're fortunate enough to have an original sketch for the painting and then the painting itself. And these paintings had to be exact to every line in exactly where it's supposed to be, every block exactly where it's supposed to be, the proportions exactly so. And he did this for a number of years and got tired of it. Just felt like he wasn't achieving anything as an artist, and he wanted to capture art. He wanted to capture light and landscape, and so he began traveling to the Arctic, and he would make several trips throughout the 1860s to the Arctic, some of which he would carry a camera along, and he actually took photographs, and he traveled with a couple of photographers, and we'll see that in here in a little bit. But these two paintings in particular in the Whaling Museum collection, this top one is a William Bradford, and the bottom one is Albert Van Beest. And if you compare them, you could see the influence. You could see the development in Bradford as an artist based on Van Beest's influences. And significantly, you can also see this view of Union Wharf here with the ships hove down at the wharf and ships actually being built in Fairhaven. So this is the Port of New Bedford from Crow Island. So that's what this painting is. And then this one down here is a view of the shipping in New Bedford Harbor, which actually shows Fort Phoenix is in the lower right here. So this is out, right out sort of toward Egg Islands, and right out in the middle of the harbor out there. And this vessel is at anchor. It's either coming or going. We're not sure. It could be either. could be outfitting all these small craft sailing back and forth, outfitting the vessel, or it could have just come in, be at anchor in the quarantine ground, and these small vessels are taking the crew off and taking them back. But you know, this demonstrates, again, not only is it the exact nature of the painting technique, but a sophisticated composition and an increasing sense of the larger scope of the art, and that's what we see here in this monochromatic charcoal on paper sketch, which is hanging downstairs, in this building in the clerk's department, and you can go in and see it. It's another of these whaler trapped in the ice in the Arctic pictures. So we can see that the composition enhances the view, the sheer magnitude of the landscape, while putting the action sort of off to one side, but nonetheless your eye moves all around. And these fellows here in this little, pulling this little boat over the ice, are a theme that recur again and again in these works. So you see this over and over again. What's challenging with these Bradford pictures is to figure out exactly what it is he was drawing and when he was drawing it. So he made hundreds of sketches. Here's a detail, so we could see these in detail. And here in the lower right, this is just a completely separate picture, but you can see that he incorporates the same technique of these shadowy figures dragging a boat, onto the shore or across the ice, and some pretty fine details of whale boats. You can tell it's a whale boat. It's got a loggerhead, and it's a double-ended boat, and there, it's a three-rigged, looks like a bark that's trapped in the ice. And the thing is as we, let's go back for a second. So here's the picture it's actually in Fairhaven downstairs, and you can see all of these elements to it. But these are just other sketches that are in the Whaling Museum collection that show essentially the same thing. This is obviously a sketch for sealers crushed, and these others are all just elements of the same themes that Bradford seemed to latch onto as the kind of scene that he would develop into his fine art. So he made 8 trips to the coast of Labrador and the Eastern Arctic between 1856 and 69. Hundreds of sketches of fishing boats, sealers, whalers. But at this time, New London, Connecticut, in particular, was doing a lot of whaling in the Eastern Arctic, like half a dozen ships were wrecked there over about 10 or 12 years. One of them was the brig Georgiana in 1868, and here we have a wrecked brig. Is it the Georgiana? Who knows? This looks like another view of a wrecked brig. It's got 2 masts. It's hard to say, exactly what he saw and whether that can be exactly documented. But what can be documented exactly are the photographs that he took on his cruise to the Arctic region in the steamer Panther in 1869 with Boston photographers John Dunmore and George P. Critcherson. With these photographs, out of that voyage came a sumptuous book, just a big, beautiful book of photographs of the high Arctic. This was published by subscription, and there weren't many made, but there are 3 of them here in the region. One in the Millicent Library, one at the Whaling Museum, and one at the New Bedford Free Public Library. So we have 3 of these fabulous photo compilations, and they, it moves the art in a different direction. So photography itself is an art form, And you can look at the photographs and look at the paintings and begin to see some of the relationship that Bradford developed as his work went on. The next artist we'll look at is Robert Swain Gifford, R. Swain Gifford to his friends. This painting that I'm highlighting here is another one from the Whaling Museum collection, and it was Gifford painted it while he was on the 1899 Harriman expedition to Alaska. This was a voyage of exploration and documentation, and one of the paintings here is this view of the steamer Marian Helen off Port Clarence, Alaska. It's just a monumental work. Again, getting back to the composition, you can see the great interest in the foreground, just the way that the canvas is organized, that draws your eye, just like you are an Arctic indigenous person on the strand, looking out toward this steam whaler in the water, and this bright patch of red down here in the lower right just pulls you right into the picture. So Gifford was born. He was a working class guy. His dad was a waterman of various sorts, and he was born and lived out of Nonamesset Island, one of the Elizabeth Islands, sort of northeast of Nausea, and you could see Falmouth easily from there, Woods Hole. And his family moved to Fairhaven, and he too became acquainted with Albert von Beest, and became very closely associated with the artist. And they actually created a couple of whaling prints together that weren't particularly good whaling prints. There was a third whaling print that Benjamin Russell of New Bedford had to actually correct. So he had to actually go to this and look at the two that these guys created and said, it wasn't exactly right. So he made a third one that was better. But Gifford, became friends with Walton Ricketson of New Bedford, and they traveled around to the Adirondacks and Bay of Fundy, and around the same regions as William Bradford. Gifford went to New York. He studied in Boston as well. He studied at the National Academy in New York, and he was elected to the National Academy of Design in 1866. So he was a pretty young guy, 26 years old. He traveled west. He traveled to Europe and North Africa in the 1870s. And when he returned to the region, he concentrated on etchings and photographs and painting local scenes. And again, he was invited to accompany the Harriman expedition in 1899, and that's where he completed, that Marian Helen picture. Some of the other people on that expedition, by the way, included Edward Curtis, John Muir, William Dahl, for whom the Dahl sheep is named, and George Bird Grinnell, among others. Here's some early works of Gifford. So he did an early whaling scene. He had never actually been whaling. But he was obviously interested in and exposed to, growing up in this region, the particulars of what a whale ship actually looked like, what whaleboats looked like, and you can see that he's getting an interest, this Van Beest and Bierstadt interest in composition, where he puts something of interest sort of in the foreground to create a view that draws your eye in, and he traveled to the Bay of Fundy like so many of these guys did, and painted a view of Grand Manan. So many of these artists painted that region. But the artwork that's held here in Fairhaven is the Paden Aram Salt Vats, oil on canvas, and that's hanging across the street in the Millicent Library. And this is one of several works. Note this bright red board here in the foreground. That's pretty much what we saw in the Marian Helen painting as well. And these salt vats, were really pretty important to the function of the whale fishery in the region, simply because these long voyages required salt meat, and they require, they made their own salt. So, and here are several other views of the, here's an etching, that shows the salt works at Paden Aram. This is actually a plate, so that's a copper plate etching. This is a very large oil painting held at the museum, and this is a study piece. It's unframed, and it's held at the museum. But they all sort of show the same theme that this fabulous painting in the Fairhaven collection shows. And here's just by the by one of his European views of St. Mark's in Venice. Another local guy, Charles Henry Gifford. This was a view of an island off Ireland that he painted when he was on his way to Scotland on a voyage to paint and sketch. So he was a Fairhaven native. He grew up his son of a ship carpenter. He was self-taught, but marine scenes seemed to have been natural to him. I mean, he just was immediately drawn to marine scenes. He was never a ship portraitist, but he concentrated on seascapes, harbors, boats, and coastal views. He was in the U.S. Army, 2 stints in the U.S. Army during the Civil War, and he too traveled Lake George, Bay of Fundy, Ireland, and Scotland. And then later his studio was in an art framer's down near the waterfront, and he didn't paint giant pictures. He painted what are called gems. He painted small pictures and sold them out of the framers. So he was actually making a living selling relatively small works locally, and he was able to travel more, and he famously built himself this tower studio up on Poverty Point. So we'll see that in another picture, in a Lemuel Eldred picture here in a minute. So that's just really kind of neat. And he's a real sort of local art success story, that man. And here's so here it is. This is the Ballycastle, coast of Ireland, oil on canvas. Just a very fine painting that incorporates the elements of small boats, monumental landscapes, beautiful light, and this was actually donated by the Phoebe Hearst of San Francisco in 1894. Presented to the town of Fairhaven. This is good. This is great stuff. I mean, the artists were recognized, the patrons were important people, and the town itself was recognized. Probably very much through the influence of Henry Huddleston Rogers and this sort of beautiful downtown that Rogers created. Here it is framed, and it's in the clerk's office here in the town hall, like we said. Another similar view of fishing scene, probably somewhere up in the Bay of Fundy that he painted in 1875. So you can see the sort of general themes that he enjoyed, but he also painted this fabulous view of a great big striped bass, that was actually hanging in the fishing club over at Cuddyhunk. It hung over the mantelpiece for years before it came into the Whaling Museum collection. This is these stands were where the guys would go out and fish for striped bass in the surf off these rocks, great big striped bass. So that's just a pretty great sort of regional piece. Charles Henry Gifford and C.H. Gifford himself, painted this scene, from his studio up there on Poverty Point, showing Joshua Slocum outfitting the spray, and that spot right there where he was outfitting, rebuilding, and working on the spray it's a kind of a memorial now. It's like a nice open spot, and you can go and see it. So that's kind of neat. This is sort of once over lightly, even though I'm going on for 45 minutes or an hour almost. Any one of these artworks could take a great deal of examination and exploration and discussion, just like this entire history of this region. I'm going through it pretty quickly, but Joshua Slocum is a big and important story. for this area, and we could talk about him for a long time. So here it is. Here's this view, and this is a Lemuel Eldred view, and there's a C.H. Gifford studio, but this is this very ancient and really important piece of land in local history. This was where the action was long before Bedford Village, long before Fairhaven Village. Oxford Point was where the ship and boat building took place in this harbor, and whaling voyages sailed out. Before this was, Bedford Village was settled in 1765. This was already an active place at that time, and it would become less important after the bridge was built across the harbor, and Oxford Point became cut off. But this is a Lemuel Eldred painting, and you begin to see some of the kind of similarities in the way these artists, the way they painted, the way they composed their pictures, and some of their subject matters. And these paintings are really worth paying a great deal of attention to, especially these Lemuel Eldred pictures, which are pretty precise for the architecture and of the region and what buildings were where, and just a general technique. In technique, he's very similar in many ways to R. Swain Gifford. And here's a pretty fantastic photo of Lemuel Eldred down on the New Bedford waterfront, painting. I think that's the bark Paulina, which was a decrepit whaler and was being broken up. But Eldred, like Gifford and Bradford, grew up in Fairhaven. He was the son of a boat builder, inspired to paint as a youth. And he was actually influenced by the decorative painter Caleb P. Purrington. Purrington painted signs, he painted carriages, he painted like interior murals and things like that. And he also collaborated with Benjamin Russell on the grand panorama of a whaling voyage around the world. So Eldred and Purrington worked together and developed a working relationship and a friendship. He also studied with William Bradford, who was in many ways his mentor. He invited Eldred to New York to study and work, and Eldred was subsequently admitted to the National Academy of Design. He later studied in Boston, and like most of these fellows, he traveled abroad. He learned etching, and some of his most famous works are etchings of the New Bedford waterfront: whale ships, harbor views, boats, whaling scenes, and other views from his travels in Europe. Apparently he was a collector of curiosities as well. All kinds of South Seas paddles and war clubs and things of that sort were in his studio. and he wrote stories, newspaper stories on local history. But the painting in question, hanging in the assessor's office, is this fantastic view of the whaler Falcon at Union Wharf. And if this reminds us a little bit of that William Bradford painting from much earlier, there's a good reason for that. These fellows influenced one another, but this is 40 years after the fact. So if William Bradford was painting whalers in this harbor in the 1850s, look at Lemuel Eldred is painting those same kinds of harbor scenes 40 years later. And this actually shows the coal bin for the railroad station. So the rail ran toward Mattapoisett, and there would have been there was a ferry that crossed from New Bedford to the rail in Fairhaven, and we see this is Union Wharf, sort of looking south toward Fort Phoenix, and like many of these artists, you see the same elements. The small craft in the foreground, small craft in relationship to the larger maritime scene, and it's just it's a superb example of his work. And this is one of my favorite paintings in this whole thing. So this is one we should probably actually sit down with sometime and just go through, pick it apart piece by piece. I think that this is the Jabez Delano Jr. Candleworks. So this would have been looking. This is the entrance to what is it? The pond over here, the salt pond. And so we're looking. This is the foot of Spring Street, looking down Middle Street, Middle or Main. I think it's Middle Street, looking down Middle Street. So Union Wharf would have been over here, and you know, just as I was driving over here today, you know, I was picturing this in my mind, because you drive right past where this, actually you drive right down where this scene is, and it's obviously very, very different now. The pond is all filled in, and there's a pumping station, you know, right here. So it's a view of foot of Spring Street, Fairhaven, 1893. And here's one of his famous etchings. So looking across here at Fairhaven, there it is. We've got the Unitarian Church. We've got, I think that might be the town hall. So that's this building with the conical tower. 1906. That would have been about right. And you know, a big fat whaler, you know, tied up at the wharf, and guys working on it. And this is, you know, this is one of his etchings, you know, from the New Bedford waterfront, late in the game. So if this is an etching from 1906, when the whale fishery was really seriously in decline, we're talking a long stretch of years from when I first started talking about the early years of William Bradford in the 1850s. So that's the presentation. That's the art. You know, this is the art that hangs in Fairhaven. You know, and I would obviously encourage people to come and talk to Mr. Mark Badwey and Mr. Derek Freitz, and you know, get a sense of what the art is, where you can see, you know, walk around and enjoy the architecture, and think a bit about the really deep and significant history of Fairhaven. So thanks for the invitation, Mark.